It gives me great pleasure to welcome all the delegates and the panelists that we've got on the GoToWebinar today for the Intervarsity Brew 2023. From CUT, I have got Olga, and I've got Chris, and I've got Maraldi. Then from SAB, we've got Kyle, that will also be your presenter today. And we also have a P-Ware from BASA. So welcome to you all. This is a great honor for me, Adele Kroch at Food Focus, to be part of yet another year of interesting webinars that we're going to host. As you know, there's one today and for the rest of the week, every day at 1 o'clock. I will confirm the topics of the other webinars after Kyle has done his presentation, but it is absolutely an honor for us to be part of this. As you can see, you have got many companies that's being part of this Intervarsity Brew competition, and it is important that you can see why it is so important for you to be part of the event, to make sure that you get valuable information, but also to make sure that we get your interest out there, and so that the industry know who you are. Before we go over to Kyle to do his presentation, I would like to show you a short video of why it is so important for you to be part of the event this year. So I hope that makes you all feel very excited about the year and being part. And it's an honor for me now to introduce you to your speaker today. So Kyle started his beer journey in 2011 as a participant in the Intervarsity Brewery competition. He is a BJCP judge since 2012, and he's been active in the brewing industry since 2014. And he has been a professional brewer since 2017. He is the brewmaster at SAB since 2021, and he's also created 2 commercial recipes in 2021, Castle Double Malt and 2M Flow. He is the SAB brewing manager for the Newlands Brewery since 2022. He is very passionate about beer and how it brings happiness to so many people. So it gives me great pleasure now to hand you over to Kyle, that will be presenting on how to brew a better beer. So Kyle, I'm handing over to you. So go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. If that video didn't get you pumped for this year's competition, I don't know what will. So once again, thanks for having me on. I'm quite excited to just give a bit of an overview of how to brew a better beer, as the competition is such a great opportunity to improve your brewing knowledge and focus. So we've already had a bit of a introduction on my side. So this first slide goes quite quick, but essentially started off with the UCT brewing team. worked within SAB Miller, SAB Limited, and AB InBev as the company has changed, and my roles switched from production in South Africa to assisting throughout Africa. And as mentioned right now, currently home base is the Newlands Brewery as the brewing manager there. So really what we're going to discuss today is a little bit about AB InBev's brewing principles, because obviously these form the foundation of what makes a great tasting beer. And then just a little bit going into the focus areas for your beers within the Intervarsity Brewing Competition, where we typically see some off flavors or opportunities to maximize the taste, just so we could make sure that you produce the best tasting entrant to make sure that you could come out as a potential category winner or overall winner. And then depending on time, a quick overview of the sensory evaluation, as I do know Chris has his session regarding that. So essentially diving straight in, there's 10 brewing principles that AB InBev believes in. And really the ones we want to focus in today are things like freshness, ingredients, and quality. So when you're talking about your recipes, you obviously want to make sure that the raw materials that you're using are of a high enough quality that you're not introducing anything that may inadvertently affect the flavor of the beer. So a cardinal sin for the competition would be, for example, using ingredients that have gone that are old or stale, something that's been left over from a year ago. You want to make sure that you're using fresh hops. You've recently bought your malt. It hasn't just been sitting around in a cupboard for 2 years, as that really can come through in the final product. That also speaks to quality, and then also a little bit around freshness, because freshness doesn't just speak to the source of your raw materials, but it can also speak to the process control. Did you make sure you limited how much dissolved oxygen went in after fermentation? Have you made sure that it hasn't been exposed to too much oxygen, or let alone having too much heat in the brewing process, or even after you packaged? So those are some of the fundamental principles that will underlie our discussion today when we dive into some of the more technical aspects. So as I'd mentioned, the focus areas for making a great tasting beer are relatively standard across all breweries. Where you may have technology or equipment which may be different, typically driven by efficiencies or brew length. This could be like dry milling versus steep milling, or wet milling, lauter tun versus mash filter, or the various types of wort boiling like external, internal, or simmer and strip. It really doesn't matter if you're brewing a 30-liter batch or a 3,000 hectoliter batch. The principles very much stay the same. So with the process, just as the high-level reminder, we're going to be taking our malts and milling it if we have adjuncts or not with the cereal cooker. We'll be mashing to convert those starches to sugar, mash separation to remove the sweet wort from the spent grains, boiling our wort primarily for hops and adjunct isomerization, wort clarification, so what you're sending towards wort cooling is as clear as possible, and then wort cooling where you'll oxygenate or aerate to start getting the process for your yeast. Because ultimately all you need is a single vessel, a way to separate the spent grain and temperature control, and finding temperature control between around 45 and 100 degrees. With this, you can definitely win the competition. Previous winners had semi-automated systems, as well as completely brewing out of a bag and a bucket. So it's really about making sure that you control the process, and with that being able to extract the best quality. So if we look at the focus area for milling, and pretty much most of my slides will look at the purpose, why is it important, and what you can check. What can you practically do at your home brewing or your brewing kit? So ultimately, milling is the process of making the starches in the grains available, and you do this by increasing the surface area and removing the husks for solubilization and conversion to sugar. So remember, the white powdery stuff, that starch needs to first solubilize into your water, into your liquor, before the naturally occurring enzymes from the barley malt are able to help do the conversion. And it's really important because this is where your available extract or gravity of your wort will be determined. So this means that if you have a very poor crush, you're never going to meet your alcohol spec. Or if you have a very, very fine crush, you may end up messing around with your lautering. So if I break that into a little bit more detail, as I said, a fine crush with the natural enzymes in the malt, you'll have better access to the starch to convert it to sugars. That's the underlying principle here. However, if you have a coarse crush, less access also means less sugars, but it does mean you could have a little bit of extra body. So you can really play around with your recipe depending on what sort of brand or what sort of category you bring towards. So a crush needs to be balanced for lautering. So for all of you who have lautering systems, you may well know that if you crush too fine or you use too much oats or rye, you may get a stuck lauter. So this is essentially where your lautering flow rate drops to zero because your bed has lost all permeability and you're now unable to circulate through. So this is why you want to try keep as much as possible a lot of intact husks that are stiff will provide good porosity, while the broken limp husks, if you were mashing in for too long, will inhibit lautering. So a little option here is to use things like rice husk or rice hulls that you could buy at your local homebrew shop to try help mitigate the lautering. So what you can do to check during your process is that when you receive your crushed malt or you crush it yourself or mill it yourself, physically check, have a look. On the picture on the right here is an example of a really good fine crush, but not too fine that it's destroyed the husk. You can see a lot of intact husk ready to go there. So is there a higher fraction of white starchy bits, which is great? And what you really want to avoid is whole kernels, which are still present, because this is really poor for your ABV or gravity in the end, because you're not going to be able to convert what's sitting inside that kernel because you physically can't solubilize it because it's all packed together. So quite a bit of focus around milling to make sure that you get your gravity that you need, because if you don't get your gravity, you don't get your alcohol, you might fall out of style for the beer, and also it helps to bring balance to the beers to prevent it from being too overly cloying or sweet. So then, as I'd mentioned around mash conversion, we really are looking at the purpose of it, which is the conversion inside your mash tun or adjunct cooker, focused on the solubilization of starches, followed by the enzymatic breakdown of the starches to fermentable and unfermentable sugars. So if your milling wasn't right, you would never going to get your solubilization of starches, and your enzymes won't be able to do anything in the end. So typically what you would be looking at on your right is your mash conversion profile, where you've got time and temperature, and then these specific times and ramp rates are basically how you are setting the carbohydrate spectrum for your beer. So this is important again, because this is where your ABV and body of beer is being determined. Because if you have a high amount of fermentable sugars, you're not going to have a lot of starches or sugars left over, or dextrins, to help with body of your beer. So you'll have a very thin drinking beer, something that we try push with Castle Light as an example, as opposed to something like Castle Double Malt, where we've got a significantly higher amount of unconverted sugars or carbohydrates to give a lot more smoother and rich flavor. So this is essentially your opportunity in the mash tun to provide your carbohydrate spectrum. And you're really looking for gentle mixing, so you don't have hot spots or cold spots in your mash vessel. And essentially your critical parameters, which are listed out on your right over here, which are your time, temperature, and pH. Because if you don't nail these pH or temperature, you're not allowing the enzymes the time and the activity to be able to do their conversion. So it's so critical that you keep that in mind, because if you're really trying to go push for high alcohol, you want to be sitting at 60 to 63 degrees for the majority of your mash at around a 5.2 pH. But if you really want to make sure that you've got that full conversion range, you need to make sure that your alpha and beta amylase enzymes are at the right temperature. So you can see that if you're running in the 60 to 63, you'll be focusing on the beta amylase. This is an endo-acting enzyme. So essentially it bites off little chunks at the end. It creates maltose, the 2 carbohydrate or 2 starch sugar, as opposed to alpha amylase, which just cuts indiscriminately on the longer change, except for the dextrins at those branches, because it literally can't fit in there, as it is a protein and it is stereoactive. So if you're really trying to go for just like a general high extract or most fermentable wort, you're looking between the 65 to 68%, 65 to 68 degrees Celsius. And then if you want to keep pushing the conversion, you want to spend some time around that 70 degrees. Keeping in mind that if you overshoot the 60, go straight to 70, you won't be able to come back down to 60, because you would have inactivated your protein. Your beta amylase would have it would have untangled or unraveled, and you wouldn't have been able to continue that conversion. So as I'd mentioned, with the time, temperature, and pH in the table, what you can check is things like your mash gravity, your first wort gravity and your final wort gravity, as this can give you the initial estimate of what your alcohol of the beer will be. You need to be measuring your time and your mash tuns, especially if you rebrewing the same recipe over again and you're just trying to optimize. By having the baseline of what time and temperature you were at, as well as pH, and then adjusting those by 5 or 10 minutes, you should be able to then start seeing increasing or decreasing in your alcohol content or your gravity. You definitely want to constantly have temperature measurement. You don't want to have spikes or deviations that can give you false belief in that your system's working right. If it's not constant, you may run into trouble where you will get under conversion. And then finally, your mash pH at the start and the end, because obviously at the start it's still mostly going to be water with a little bit of crushed grains, but towards the end you're obviously going to have the conversions that would drop your pH through the process. As the process of producing beer will take your starting pH water around 7 and finish up with beer at around 4.5. And then finally, before you inactivate the enzymes, inactivation typically from heat or pH, you can conduct an iodine starch test. This is something that you can easily pick up at your local pharmacy. And you basically take a little bit of the mash and just in a shallow bowl with the mash liquor, even ask your chemistry department, just go put a few drops in there. If you see the iodine turn black, it's in the presence of starch. And if it's purplish, brownish, then it's definitely converted to sugars. So that's a good way for you to check how your process is going along. So I won't spend a lot of time on lautering, as we did pretty much mention it during the milling, but happy to chat about it afterwards, or any questions around it. But essentially with lautering, you're just doing phase separation. But really where it's more important for us is around the kettle boil, as you can definitely taste as a trained taster or a BJCP judge if something went wrong during this part of the process. Because historically there were around 10 outcomes of the boil, but most of these days can be achieved without boil. And for small scale, but however, for small scale brewing, all 10 reasons still remain valid. So why is it important? This is where your wort quality and specification is set. You're essentially stopping any enzymatic activity. So you're essentially locking in your carbohydrate profile, which your yeast will be using for fermentation. And things like short boils or too gentle can result in your smelly volatiles remaining. So these are going to be like your isobutyl aldehydes. It could be some of your onion flavors, some of your starchy potato flavors or grainy, where you were, and even DMS, where you're unable to extract it. You want to basically boil it off. So you want like quite a nice rolling boil. However, if you go for too long or too vigorous, you can cause excess color and flavor formation due to the Maillard reactions, which is your sugars and your proteins that are all in your wort that are reacting together in the process of heat and creating those Maillard compounds. And if it's really long or really vigorous, you could have localized you could have localized boiling or hot spots that results actually in caramelization. And the big challenge with caramelization is, while it may give your beer an interesting taste, the caramelized sugars are you're unconverted by the yeast, so you'll lose out on your gravity or your alcohol. So the main reasons, as I'd mentioned, for boiling is around sterilizing wort. Quite important, because if you have a micro infection in your brew house or in your wort and you put yeast with it, you're going to have a very off-tasting beer, unless that's what you want to get. For those of you who are experienced with kettle sours or wild fermented beers. Hop isomerization, extremely important. This is where you're turning your hops that you've typically received either from SAB or your local homebrew store, where you need to convert it from its unisomerized phase, which will be non-soluble in water, to isomerized, which means it'll be soluble in your wort, which means actually giving your bitterness there. That's why when you dry hop late in the process, you actually don't get bitterness, because it's not soluble in water. You just keep the flavor and aroma aspects. Then there's trub formation. This is all the proteins that came with the malt. You want to coagulate them and try remove them before you go into wort cooling. Volatile stripping, as I'd mentioned, things like DMS and isobutyl aldehyde. Stop enzymatic reactions, so sets your carbohydrate spectrum. So with those main 5 reasons, there's 5 consequences. So these are the 10 outcomes, and it's 5 reasons, 5 consequences. It's color development, pH drop. You concentrate your wort because you're removing water from the boil in the form of evaporation. Any additions you want to add in, such as fruit or flavors, and then flavor formation through the Maillard reaction. So what can you do to check what's going on with your kettle boil? Well, first off, the evaporation rate. You could check your gravity before and after, and if you haven't added any additional adjuncts, so if you've just got 100% malt or you've added adjuncts later up in the boil, the concentration increase is directly related to the evaporation rate, and you could just do a quick calculation on that. And the alternative is you could just time, and then also you want to be timing your hop or alternative additions for consistency if you're brewing the same recipes over again. However, keep in mind that the typical standard for wort boiling, especially at a commercial scale, is around 60 minutes, as low as 45. So even though you might think 5 minutes may not be long, it could be up to 8% of your boil time, and it can drastically change the flavor and profile of your wort, which means it'll change the flavor and profile of your beer. So once you've got your wort, you want to go into wort cooling. You want to get it down to the temperature as to where you don't accidentally kill your yeast. If you pitch yeast into 30 or 40 degree wort, you will start killing it. So you really want to be going around 15, 10 degrees, depending on where you get it. But really the purpose of yeast pitching is that yeast is the key player in turning your wort into beer. Without yeast, you would just have sweet wort sitting in your fermenter, and it'll make a great energy drink, but there's going to be no alcohol, no esters, nothing really exciting in there. So your yeast type and quantity will play a major role in the outcome of your beer, because it'll impact your sweetness, your body, and your ester profile of the beer, and of course the alcohol content. So what you want to be looking at on your right is obviously keeping it very clean, because the middle image on the right where the red X is, you can see these little rods all over the place. This is yeast that has been contaminated with a bacteria. This means that the bacteria is going to be consuming the sugars and producing all sorts of other funny things that you may or may not want, depending on what style of beer you're creating. So for wild fermentations, that'll look fine, but if you want to make a nice, clean, crisp lager, those rods are likely going to give your beer a whole bunch of off flavors, notably sulfurs and sour aspects. While at the bottom right is a very good example of clean, healthy yeast ready for pitching. You can see the cells all nicely intact, all relatively good size, and no funny bits and pieces except maybe a little bit of trub sitting in the middle top there. So why is this important? This is because you have got pitching of healthy yeast can be the difference between a clean and desirable fermentation versus rotten eggs or vinegar. So if your yeast is not good quality, your final beer will not be good quality. This can result in sluggish fermentations, leading to green apple notes, acetaldehyde, and diacetyl butterscotch. These are two of the most common off notes that we pick up in beers for the Intervarsity, besides some of the sour, but acetaldehyde and butterscotch comes through quite often. So what can you check for? If you're using dried yeast packets, you're typically looking at one packet for 30 liters at a gravity of 1050, and you preferably want to hydrate it beforehand. And you want to hydrate either with sterile wort from cooling or sterile water, not deionized, just sterile, before pitching to ensure the yeast is properly mixed in the wort. Because what happens is if you just open the top of your tank, there could have been some foam there from the proteins from the wort boiling and the wort cooling, and then you just pour your yeast in and then it just sits dry on the top of the fermenter. So you end up under pitching and you have slow fermentations. So the other alternative is that if you're reusing yeast from previous brews, essentially if you're cropping and repitching, you're looking at around 1.5 times 10 to the 6 or 1.5 million cells per mil per 1 degree plate of wort gravity. That's just a general standardization of where you want to be going to make sure that you have enough yeast to be able to do the job. And then another check you can definitely do is that if you are based at a university that you have labs around, you can check under a light microscope for bacterial infection. So you just create a slope and then you can just see on the right as the examples. So then going back into fermentation. So there's quite a lot going on over here on this page, but let's just quickly go through the purpose, which is obviously where the yeast is converting the fermentable sugars into ethanol and other hundreds of different metabolites. So your yeast variety is going to determine what comes out. This is why if you're going for Belgian strains, you want to be using a Belgian yeast. Don't go use a local yeast because you might lose out on some key characteristics. If you want to make a Weiss beer, you definitely need a Weiss yeast. You need something that has the PAD gene, something that can produce 4-vinyl glycol using the phenol acrylate decarboxylase gene inside that yeast. And essentially it's important because you need to control this fermentation to predict your final beer. So typically in your primary fermentation, so if we, and we'll go into the graphs on the right, that's where you're going to be converting your alcohol. While your secondary fermentation is typically your cleanup. This is now removing things like, or the final cleanup of acetaldehyde to alcohol, or diacetyl to the non-perceptive conversion. And then the other thing is that if you have a stressed fermentation, um, the trained tasters and the BJCP panelists can pick it up. They can smell that maybe there was something wrong. And then at that point, you could end up having a bit of your score impacted. So before I go into what we can check, just looking at the uni-tank and the two-tank process over here, is that you'll typically have your temperature control start a bit low to help with your gravity, to not shock your yeast and to help for your alcohol conversion. Then you might step it up a bit higher to help at your secondary fermentation, where you want to now convert your acetaldehydes and your diacetyls into non-sensory related molecules, so you don't pick it up. And then once your fermentation completes, then you want to drop the temperature to as low as possible, typically around 4 degrees at the end, in preparation for cold maturation, because at this point you want to stop the yeast from potentially autolyzing or causing other additional fermentation issues. How do you know your fermentation has completed? I'll go into that now as to what you can do to check. So if you can, you want to have temperature control during fermentation. However, it's not a train smash if your system does not. We still have had beers win competitions that didn't have the best temperature control. It's just that it helps you with your reproducibility of your beers. So essentially, fermentation has ended after beer gravity stops decreasing. This means no more alcohol is produced. So your yeast has consumed the oxygen in the wort to grow. Once it stops growing, it's going to start consuming the starches without the presence of oxygen to convert to alcohol and produce CO2. You need to be checking your gravity daily, because once your gravity has stopped decreasing for 2 to 3 days, you have to remove the yeast off the beer. Because if you leave beer on the yeast for more than 3 days, your yeast is sitting in your beer and it's got nothing to do. So what it does is it starts eating itself from the inside. So this is called yeast autolysis. And it will essentially eat itself until the point that it destroys its cell wall, and then it explodes its guts and innards into the beer, releasing things like acetaldehyde, bad sulfurs. It can even give additional proteins that change the flavor of the beer. So it's really important to make sure that you try remove your yeast, and that's typically from crash cooling to get it to as low as possible, and then let it sediment out. So even though you've got ale and lager yeasts, your ale yeast will also settle out over time. So you want to try remove it as much as possible. Keeping your beer on your yeast, keeping your yeast in your beer for a week or two is definitely going to result in things like tasters picking up cooked cabbage sulfurs. It's quite clear. Keeping in mind that unless you're going through a centrifuge or a filter, there's always going to be a little bit of yeast left behind in the wort, and that could keep doing any additional mopping up or cleanup that you might have concerns with. And then finally, you also want to try add a little bit of zinc addition. You're looking to 0.2 to 0.3 milligrams per liter, as this helps as a cofactor for the yeast to convert sugars to ethanol. You also don't want to add too much because it could be toxic to it. And also, yeast doesn't like CO2 in solution. So you really want to minimize CO2 pressure in the fermenter. So that's why you typically have an airlock that bubbles off. So don't bung it accidentally for the whole fermentation. It can definitely cause yeast stress. So in the top right, just as an example, these are most of the factors that can be affecting your flavors. Specifically, if you look at your raw materials, yeast, and process facilities, you want to be making sure things like your gravity, sugar profile, fan or nitrogen, you typically don't have to worry about too much, especially with 100% malt beers. Your oxygen or aeration concentration, zinc, lipids coming from your malt, and buffering capacity really speaks to the calcium in your water and how your malt is going to be reacting with it for pH control. In terms of process, your temperature of your fermentation, your air or oxygen introduction, your pitching rate. So if you pitched 3 packets of yeast instead of 1, it means that your yeast is not going to grow a lot, but a lot of yeast is going to be already there present. So it's going to consume the sugars and convert the alcohol faster. So you're going to have a very fast fermentation, which can then reduce the sort of ester formation because it's really following a different pathway at that point. CO2 concentration, are you agitating it or not? Single or multi-brews, because that speaks to something known as yeast-air contact time. Filling and pitching procedure, so if you need to be making sure it's being done sterile, you're making sure you're not introducing unnecessary inputs, and then finally yeast management, which was what we discussed before. So that's essentially the process related to it. I'll just only spend a minute or two on the sensory evaluation, because I know Chris has got a whole presentation on that, but essentially the competition is judged according to BJCP, so know your score sheets. This is what the judges will basically be marking your beers against. So basically it'll be a good opportunity for you to familiarize yourself with this, especially when you're determining which category you're brewing from. And in the past competitions, there's really been great beers but entered in the wrong category, so they get scored low. So really spend enough time to evaluate your beer and make sure it's in the right category. And keeping in mind your judges are typically either BJCP trained or SAB trained. I say SAB and not Heineken because most of our Heineken brewers did spend some time in SAB. So very much aligned to the training there, where you've got identifying lager styles and any deviation defects to assist in brewing problem solving, versus BJCP, which is really about identifying styles and how the individual beer attributes complement the style. So just spend a bit of time with your beer in the score sheet just to make sure you give yourself the best opportunity. And then just in terms of common issues that we see in the beers, we've got, these are the off flavors that I typically see most within the InterVarsity brewing competition. So you can see a little legend on the here on the right. F is found in fresh beer, A is formed during aging, E is external contamination, and M is microbiological contamination of beer. So you can see things like DMS, which is that cooked corn or tomato sauce smell, that can come from a whole variety of areas: fresh beer, aging, external contamination, or micro contamination. Versus things like mercaptan, which is methanethiol, which is basically a stressed fermentation, or it's going to be from a microbiological contamination. Same for pretty much your lactic acid, acetic acid, your mercaptan, and your diacetyl typically is due to microbiological contamination of beer, so cleanliness and hygiene is so important. Things like acetaldehyde, DMS, H2S are really introduced mostly from your stressed fermentations, or DMS from a poor boil. And then chlorophenol is typically external contamination of beer, like moldy water or mold in the presence of chlorinated water. That will then give you that medicinal sort of flavor and aroma. And then finally, your metallic, which is essentially a taint, to carry over either from your brewing equipment or from your bottling process, or even from your water. So just be careful. If you see any rust or anything on your equipment, it's so important to sort that out. You want to scrub it down. You want to passivate it with a bit of acid to make sure it seals up nicely, because this you could really taste. You could taste that metallic or that bloodness in the beer itself. So probably the biggest detractor in C20 as well as in C21 and C22, so the ones that have been around for a while, is trans 2-nonenal, the papery, the oxidation of beer. So this one really came through in the last 3 years, specifically with COVID being a factor, because the teams would be brewing beers well in advance. You would be brewing it 6 to 9 months before the competition. So what would happen is that if your oxygen control was not perfect, what would happen is that even if there was a small amount, it would react inside the beer with the proteins and polyphenols and create this trans 2-nonenal. And this is basically like chewing on paper or cardboard. So just please keep that in mind, that for the competition, you really want to try brew closer rather than later, especially if you're not so confident in your oxygen control. And that is it for my presentation today. Is there any questions from the audience? Anything around the process, recipes, troubleshooting, ingredients, or anything in general?
Kyle, thank you so much. Wow, I just love the way that you have put your presentation together. At this stage in time, it seems like you've done it so well that there's no current questions. So I would really like to ask the delegates that's in the room currently to make sure that they type in their questions. But yeah, I absolutely love the way that you've put your slides together and the way that you've gone through the process, and on each slide giving the information of the purpose of the process and why it's important and what they can check. So I really think that is such valuable information, to basically use as a checklist for, all the delegates that are in the webinar at the moment. What I also can see is, as a summary for me, is how important planning is. And I think in this stage in time with load shedding and everything that's happening, time and temperature control was often mentioned. And then obviously, the starting of the process with checking your raw ingredients and making sure your equipment is clean and the way that you are working is going to be perfect. So I really think that is so important. And then, yeah, like you also said, knowing what you're going to be judged against. I really think that, like the saying say, start with the end in mind before actually starting.
Adele, it's Anton here. Can you hear me?
Yes, Anton. Yes, you're welcome. If you've got something to say, please go ahead.
Kyle, can you hear me?
Yes, everybody can hear you.
Yes, we
You
can
can
hear
go
you, Anton.
ahead.
Yeah, just quickly from Kyle's experience now, especially Kyle, you've also been in the game now for a while. If you, where would money be best spent? If there was 5,000 or 10,000 rand in the kitty, in your estimation, with the tasting and seeing some of the kit at some of the universities, where would that money be best spent? Better cleaning or better temperature control? Or if you understand what I'm saying, if money's tight, where should it be spent first in your estimation?
Oh, that's a brilliant question, Anton. Okay, so there's almost never there's no real money that you need for cleaning. A little bit of elbow grease, a brush, a little bit of detergent. You can do that all yourself manually. Where I would start with is definitely around temperature control in your mash tun, because if you don't get that right, you're never going to get your alcohol, you're never going to get your OE, you're never going to get your balance of the beer. So you might be going for something that needs to be thinner drinking, but it's going to be thicker drinking. It's going to be a lot more robust because you couldn't get the carbohydrate spectrum right. Or on the other end, you may be over converted, and then your beer ends up being too thin drinking and can't stand up to maybe the high hops you're using. So I definitely start off in the mash tun for temperature control. Then I would move to the kettle just to make sure you can boil at a consistent temperature and not cause local caramelization. And then thirdly, I would then go look at fermentation temperature control. But temperature control for me would be the number one thing, starting off in the mash tun, followed by the kettle, and then the fermenters.
Right.
Okay, that seems to be, all the questions that has been asked. I just want to say to everybody that signed in that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the website. And the website is intervarsitybrew.co.za. Kyle will also send me a PDF of his presentation, and I will make sure that that's also downloadable for you. So you will also then be able to have all those awesome slides that he made, providing you with the purpose and why it's important and what you can do to check. I think that Kyle has mentioned to you already that Chris Roth will be presenting tomorrow, and his focus is on the BJCP and how to complete the entry form and what will be looked at. We've also got on the 16th the do's and don'ts of beer label design, which Maroli Kotze will do. And then the final webinar will be presented by Jacques Janse van Rensburg, and he's going to speak on yeast selection and nutrition. So please make sure that you sign in for the following webinars for the week. And Kyle, I just want to say thank you for your time and for the amazing presentation. We really do appreciate it.
Great present, great.
Awesome. And then please, everybody, after the presentations, after the recording will stop, you're going to get a short survey. It's probably going to take you not longer than 3 minutes just to complete. So please be so kind and just answer those questions to provide us with more information. And thank you to everybody, the panelists that's been on. And I just want to check, is there anybody on the panel that would like to say something else? At this time, it seems like we're all happy. I'm looking forward meeting you tomorrow, same time, same place, just a different presenter and topic, but have absolutely an amazing day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.